He was 26 years old. He had a wife, a 4-month-old daughter, and a half-built crib in the back of his auto shop that he worked on after closing, sanding the rails smooth so the baby would never catch a splinter. On a cold morning in March of 1994, in the town of Halsey, Indiana, Daniel Pruitt walked out of his own life and, according to everyone who mattered, never once looked back. His truck turned up at the bus depot 2 towns over. Money was missing from the shop's safe. And the story wrote itself, the way these stories always do, into something simple and shameful. Another young man who couldn't carry the weight of a family and ran. That is not a story about a man who abandoned his wife and child. That is a story about a lie so complete that it raised a little girl from infancy all the way to adulthood, and a truth that sat in an unmarked grave for 27 years, waiting for a science that hadn't been invented yet. But before we get to the test that finally broke it open, you have to go back to that cold spring in Halsey. Because to understand the lie, you first have to understand who Danny Pruitt really was. Halsey, Indiana, in 1994, was a town of about 2,300 people set down flat in farm and factory country. The kind of place where the loudest sound on a winter night was the wind moving across the open fields. Most families had an answering machine by then, and a Blockbuster membership, and a pager for the man of the house. But the rhythms of the town were older than any of that. Men fixed their own trucks. Women hung wash on the line even in March. On Friday nights, the high school gym filled up, and on Sunday mornings, the 3 churches on Main Street competed politely for the same parking. Danny Pruitt ran the auto shop at the edge of town with his older brother Roy. Pruitt Brothers Garage, the sign said. Though everyone knew Danny was the one with the gift for engines, and Roy was the one who kept the books. Danny was the younger of the 2 by 6 years. The dreamer. The one who would stay late under a car when he didn't have to. The one who tipped the high school kids extra for sweeping up. He had married his sweetheart Sheila the summer before, and in November of 1993, they had a daughter, Megan. Danny taped a photograph of the baby to the lid of his toolbox, so she would be the first thing he saw every morning. He had a habit the whole shop knew him by. Every evening before he locked up, he would call home from the shop phone, and if Megan was awake, Sheila would hold the receiver to the baby's ear so Danny could sing to her, off-key and unashamed, until she settled. He was saving to get them out of the rented duplex and into a real house, and he kept the down payment in cash in the shop safe, $11,000, counted and recounted. Almost enough. Sheila used to say later that those were the best months of her life and she hadn't even known it. They were poor and tired and happy. Danny would come home smelling of motor oil and lift the baby out of the crib at midnight just to look at her. He had picked the house already, a little white place on Sycamore with a fenced yard, and he'd drive Sheila past it slow on Sunday afternoons so they could imagine it. Roy, his older brother, would tease him about it at the shop, told him a man with a new baby had no business chasing a mortgage. But Roy always said it with a smile, and Sheila never thought a thing of it. On Saturday, the 12th of March, 1994, Danny closed the shop late and stayed to work on the crib. He called Sheila a little after 8 and told her he'd sanded the last rail and would be home by 10 to put it together. He sang to Megan over the phone. He told Sheila to leave the porch light off. He had his key. That was the last time anyone who loved him would ever hear his voice. What happened next was never a search. It was a story, and the story arrived almost too quickly. Sheila waited up until past midnight, then past 1, telling herself the heater in the truck had quit again. By morning she was calling the shop, the hospital, the state police line. It was Roy who came to the duplex a little after 9 on Sunday, hat in his hands, and told her gently that maybe Danny had needed to get away. He'd seemed restless lately, Roy said, talking about how heavy it all was. The baby, the money, the house. Sheila didn't believe a word of it. Then, the truck was found. Danny's blue Ford pickup, parked neat and locked in the long-term lot at the Crawford Bus Depot, 16 miles from Halsey. And when Roy opened the shop safe to make the Monday deposit, the $11,000 was gone. The house money. To Sheriff Dale Quint, that settled it. A man with cash troubles, a truck at the bus station, missing savings, and a brother saying he'd been talking about leaving. Records show the sheriff classified it within the week. Not a missing person, a man who left. She begged him to look closer. She told him about the crib. A man does not spend his last Saturday sanding the rails of a crib for a daughter he is about to abandon. She told him Danny's winter coat was still on the hook by the shop door, that his razor was still in the duplex, that he had left the photograph of Megan taped to his toolbox. The sheriff listened the way men of that era listened to grieving young wives, kindly and without hearing a thing. He told her people surprise you. He told her to think of the baby. There were threads, if anyone had pulled them. Danny's coat on the hook meant he had walked out into a March night in his shirt sleeves, which no man does by choice. He had drained his and Sheila's joint account of exactly nothing the week he supposedly fled, leaving her every dollar they had outside the safe. The bus depot in Crawford ran one northbound and one southbound coach a day, and a check of the manifests would have shown no ticket sold in Danny Pruitt's name that week, or any week after. But no one checked, because there was nothing to check. The case was not unsolved. In the eyes of the law, there was no case at all. It is hard to overstate how completely that single classification, a man who left, sealed the truth in the ground. A search was never organized. A dog was never run. The ditch off Route 9 was never walked. The town thought of the baby, too, and that was its own kind of cruelty. The casseroles that came in the first week stopped coming in the second. The looks changed. Poor Sheila, married a runner. She was 23 years old with an infant and a duplex she couldn't afford. And the verdict of Halsey had already been entered. Her husband had chosen the open road over his own child. She kept his coat on the hook for a month, telling herself he'd be back for it. Then, she moved it to the closet, and she stopped telling people he hadn't left, because she could see what it cost her to say it. Roy was the one who held it together. He paid the shop's back bills out of his own pocket. He took over the garage and kept Danny's name on the sign, which people found touching. When Sheila fell behind on rent, Roy covered it quietly. He became, over those first hard years, the steady center the little family rotated around. The dependable older brother who had stayed when his own blood ran off. The whole town agreed there weren't many men like Roy Pruitt. And so the years began to pass, and a lie, once it is believed, does not need tending. It simply grows. By the time Megan started kindergarten, she had been taught, as gently as such a thing can be taught, that her daddy had gone away and wasn't coming back. By the time she was 10, she had stopped asking. Roy taught her to ride a bike, and later, to change the oil in her first car, in the same garage where her father had once sung to her over the phone. He never missed a birthday. He gave her a job sweeping the shop floor when she turned 15, the same floor her father had once tipped the high school kids to sweep. Megan grew up the girl whose father left, and small towns do not let a child forget a thing like that. There was always someone, a classmate, a coach, a stranger at the diner, who knew the story before she could tell her own. Every year on her birthday she would do the math without meaning to, counting how old he would be, wondering if he ever did the same. She wrote him letters as a girl that she never had an address to send. The question she never stopped asking, the one she finally said out loud to Sheila the night before her own wedding, was always the same 3 words. Why didn't he want me? Sheila never had an answer that didn't sound like a wound. Sheila never remarried. She kept Danny's winter coat in the hall closet for 27 years and never explained to anyone why. The town moved on. The duplex was torn down. The bus depot in Crawford closed and became a tire store. Sheriff Quint retired and then died, and the thin file with Danny's name on it moved into a basement and was forgotten. In the autumn of 1998, a county road crew clearing a blocked drainage culvert off Route 9, less than 4 miles from the old garage, found human skeletal remains. There was no identification. No missing person in the county records matched, because the one man it might have been was not listed as missing. He was listed as gone. The remains were entered as a John Doe, given a case number, and buried beneath a small concrete marker in the far corner of the county cemetery, under no name at all. No one in Halsey connected a nameless man in a ditch to the husband everyone knew had caught a bus out of his own life. Every case like this one represents weeks of pulling old files, cross-checking records, and sitting with the people who lived it, to give a stolen life the truth it was owed. If you want this channel to keep finding these stories and telling them with care, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what makes this work possible. Now, let's get back to Halsey. The truth came not from a detective and not from a confession, but from a small cardboard box that arrived in Megan Pruitt's mailbox in the spring of 2021. Megan was 27 by then, married and expecting a child of her own. It was the pregnancy that did it. Sitting in a doctor's office filling out a family medical history, she came to the blank for her father and felt the old ache rise up, the one she thought she'd buried. She wanted to know where she came from. She told her husband she wasn't even angry anymore. She just wanted to find the man who left and ask him why, and maybe forgive him. So she did what millions of people do now. She ordered a Dina kit, spit in a tube, mailed it back, and tried to forget about it. The science she had stumbled into works like this, in plain terms. The same public databases where ordinary people search for grandparents and lost cousins can also be used by investigators, who upload the Dina profiles of unidentified remains and then trace the family trees those profiles touch. In 2020, a cold case genealogy project had quietly entered the 1998 John Doe into one of those systems. Megan's tube of saliva, mailed off out of grief and curiosity, landed in the same database. It was a Tuesday morning in May when the call came. Not from the Ancestry Company, but from a forensic genealogist working with the state, a woman named Paula Reyes, who had been handed the strangest match of her career. Reyes drove to Halsey herself, rather than say it over the phone. She sat at Megan's kitchen table, and she explained, as carefully as she could, that the database had connected Megan to a set of remains found in a ditch off Route 9 in 1998. The man in that ditch was, beyond any statistical doubt, her father. He had not gotten on a bus. He had not started over in some other town under some other name, the way Megan had imagined 1,000 times. He had been less than 4 miles from the front door of the duplex the entire time, for 27 years, in an unmarked grave with a number for a name. He never left her. He was never able to. Sheila, when Megan told her, did not cry at first. She went to the hall closet and took down the winter coat she had kept for 27 years and held it, and only then did she come apart. The shame she had carried since she was 23, the verdict the whole town had handed her, was a lie. And if Danny had never left, then someone had put him in that ditch. And then, someone had built a story to cover it. The reinvestigation fell to a cold case detective named Owen Vance, and the first question Vance asked was the oldest one in his trade. Who benefited? The answer had been standing in the front of every photograph for 27 years. Roy Pruitt was 62 now, a respected man, the owner of the garage he had run since his brother vanished, a fixture at the church and the Rotary, the uncle who had raised his lost brother's daughter as his own. People in Halsey still spoke of how he'd stepped up. To suspect Roy was, for many in town, almost physically difficult. That difficulty had protected him for nearly 3 decades. But the remains told a story the bus depot never had. The medical examiner's re-examination found injuries that no fall and no accident could explain. Injuries inflicted by another person. The man had not wandered into that culvert. He had been carried there. And once detectives stopped asking why Danny left and started asking who put him in the ground, the old, comfortable facts curdled. The $11,000. Investigators pulled what financial records survived and found that Danny, in the weeks before he vanished, had been pressing to sell his half of the garage to put a down payment on the house. Roy could not afford to buy him out. The brothers had argued about it in front of a parts supplier just days before, loud enough that the man remembered it 27 years later. The house money that supposedly proved Danny had run was money that, on paper, had simply moved into the business Roy kept. The truck. A retired attendant from the old Crawford Depot, tracked down in a nursing home, recalled something he'd thought nothing of in 1994. He remembered a second car following the blue Ford into the lot that morning, early, before dawn, and a man getting out of the Ford and into the other car and driving back toward Halsey. He had never been asked, because no one had ever investigated. The truck at the bus depot had not been Danny leaving. It had been Roy staging. Detective Vance arrested Roy Pruitt at the garage on a Thursday afternoon, in front of the sign that still carried his dead brother's name. The news did not roar through Halsey. It fell over the town like a hard frost, settling on everything at once and killing what had grown there. The men who had admired Roy for stepping up now understood what he had stepped over. He had buried his own brother in a ditch, parked his truck at a bus station, and then spent 27 years comforting the widow and raising the child, accepting their gratitude, keeping the name on the sign. And once people knew, the small things came back to them, the way they always do. The neighbor who recalled that Roy had repaved the back lot of the garage that spring of 1994, sudden and cash only, when money was supposedly so tight. The bookkeeper who'd always wondered why Roy went quiet whenever the old house on Sycamore came up. Sheila remembered that Roy had been the one to suggest, gently, again and again over the years, that she let the search go, that chasing it would only hurt Megan. He had been there at every turn, steering, soothing, and they had all mistaken it for love. The cruelest part, Megan would say later, was not that her uncle had lied to her. It was that he had been kind while he did it, for 27 years, in the same room where it happened. Roy said little when the evidence was laid out, court records show. But in a recorded jail call to a relative, played later at his trial, he offered the only explanation he ever would, and it was somehow smaller and worse than anyone had imagined. He was going to take it all, Roy said. The shop, the name, all of it, and just go. I only wanted him to wait. A man's whole life, and the lie that swallowed his daughter's childhood, for a half share of a small-town garage. Roy Pruitt was convicted of murder and sentenced to the rest of his life in prison. Danny Pruitt was 26 years old. He had a gift for engines and a daughter whose photograph he taped to his toolbox, so she'd be the first thing he saw each morning. He sang to her over the phone every night, off-key and unashamed. On the last Saturday of his life, he stayed late to sand the rails of her crib so she would never catch a splinter, and then he called home to say he'd be back by 10. That was the man the town was told had abandoned his child. He had been building her a bed. For 27 years that crib sat wrapped in a sheet in Sheila's attic, finished but never used in the way Danny meant it. In the winter after Roy's trial, Megan brought it down, and it became the bed for Danny Pruitt's granddaughter, the great-granddaughter of his own hands. The man who supposedly walked out on his baby had built her something to sleep in, and after 27 years, that crib finally did the job it was made for. The county replaced the numbered concrete marker with a headstone that carries his name and his dates and the words father. He never left. Danny's case became one of several in the state that pushed for the routine DNA testing of long-buried, unidentified remains, and other families in other towns have gotten their own names back because of it. A lie, it turns out, can outlive almost anyone who tells it. But the truth keeps its own quiet record, in the ground and in the blood, and it does not expire. I'd like to know what you think. Roy Pruitt was caught not by a detective who suspected him, but by a daughter who simply wanted to find the father she believed had left her. Does that make the justice feel more complete, or does it make the 27 years feel even crueler? What troubles you more, the murder itself, or the decades Roy spent raising the child of the brother he killed? And how many other people lie in unmarked graves right now, written off as runaways and walkaways, waiting for a test that already exists to finally give them their names? Dunna gave Danny Pruitt back his name, his story, and his daughter after 27 years of lies. Stories like his are why this channel exists, and why we believe the truth is worth pursuing no matter how deep it gets buried. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case, and you'll find more solved cold cases waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.